Hello and welcome to The Last Word. A 7-column front-page story in today's Hindu raises critical questions about the Indian media's coverage of the killing and mutilation of 2 Jawans on the line of control. Was the coverage journalism or was it jingoism? To address that question, I have with me the Hindu's resident editor in Delhi, Praveen Swami, the editorial chairman of Outlook, Vinod Mehta, the strategic affairs editor of the Business Standard, Colonel Ajay Shukla, and the editor of Pakistan's well-known Friday Times, Najam Sethi. Praveen Swami, let's start with your front-page 7-column story in today's Hindu, which claims in a nutshell that the killing of the 2 Indian soldiers on the line of control was a tit-for-tat retaliation, essentially provoked by the Indian Army's decision to construct observation bunkers, which are essentially barred by either the understanding or the terms of the line of control ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan achieved in 2003. Do you stand by that story, or this morning have you got reasons to reconsider?
Absolutely none. Nobody's quite notably denied it, denied any of it. What the people we spoke to at the Hindu said, in essence, was that there was a small local incident with an elderly woman who crossed the line of control to join her son. This created a great many concerns about how she managed to do so, given that there's supposed to be a very high security environment there. And then the army started building some observation posts to keep an eye. Though there isn't a formal agreement, there's been an informal agreement that neither side will build fresh construction, which both sides have violated repeatedly.
And everything spiraled off
out
from
of
that.
control, absolutely.
The other thing I notice about your story is that it's repeatedly sourced to either military or government sources. In other words, you've got this from people who should know what they're talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, it would have been wonderful to have corroboration from non-partisan figures, but on the line of control there aren't any.
And finally, no one in government has got in touch to deny it or reject it.
Not a word, not a word.
Vinod Mehta, the first thing the Hindu story seems to do is to suggest that what happened at the line of control was a result of local issues and problems and not a grand strategy by Pakistan to either scupper the peace process or to deliberately undermine the ceasefire. Would you agree with that?
Well, the Hindu story does provide some useful information to fill out the story, and I'm quite prepared to believe that the retaliation did take place, that we did something on Sunday and they did something subsequently. But Karan, the question is not so much the retaliation, because on a rather nebulous line of control, these things happen. So I don't think the outrage in the country is about the retaliation. I think we're prepared to accept that there were casualties. I think the problem is the decapitation.
Okay.
And that turns the focus of the whole thing. So while retaliation may have taken place, it still doesn't explain or tell us why the decapitation was done, unless you believe in the conspiracy theory that the Indian side decapitated their own soldier to corner Pakistan.
Let me bring in Ajay Shukla at this point. Colonel Shukla, on this issue of the decapitation, another important point made by the Hindu is that the mutilation and beheading of Indian soldiers, which so enraged Indian opinion yesterday, as one television anchor said, it actually changed the moral compass in her eyes, is something that, according to some accounts, the Hindu says, has also been done by Indian soldiers to Pakistanis. In other words, this sort of treatment of soldiers has been done by both sides. Would you accept that that puts a somewhat different complexion on things?
Well, Karan, without going into the actual issue of whether Indians have decapitated Pakistanis or not, the line of control is essentially a brutal place. Both sides are killing each other. Both these armies are very hard-nosed armies with a very strong sense of macho pride, a very strong sense that we will retaliate for any killings by killings of our own. So you're not going to have any kindness or mercy shown by any side. I'm not trying in any way to justify the decapitation of soldiers. That would be a brutal act, whichever side did it. But certainly, the line of control, you're not going to have any quarter given or taken.
Okay.
And when you have an Indian raid on a Pakistani post, everybody should have been at their absolute peak alert on the Indian side. Given what had happened in Uri on Sunday, they should have been expecting retaliation from Pakistan.
Absolutely. Very quickly, before I go to Najam Sethi, Praveen Swami, I want to quote from your Hindu story, which you, in fact, are the author of, the specific point that you make about how it's possible, according to some accounts, that Indian soldiers have also, at least on one occasion, beheaded Pakistani soldiers. You say last year during a skirmish at Karna, and I'm quoting now, Indian Special Forces responded by attacking a Pakistani forward post, killing several soldiers, and by the account of one military official, which the Hindu could not corroborate independently, beheaded two. A military source has actually said this to you.
Right. And in fact, while I was researching this story, we heard multiple accounts of Indian soldiers occasionally doing these things from the early 1990s, often as retaliation. We heard of cases where soldiers had indeed been punished because no sensible officer, I suspect, either in Pakistan or in India, will tolerate this kind of behavior,
So
but it's not unknown.
So there's a track record on both sides of mutilation and sadly beheading.
Yes.
Najam Sethi, as editor of Pakistan's Friday Times, first of all, how different is the Hindu story in today's Hindu from the version you were confronted with last night when you first arrived in this country? And secondly, do you find the Hindu story acceptable and truthful?
Yes, I find the Hindu story perfectly acceptable. I must tell you that when I arrived last night, I was quite stunned by the prejudice of the media, and especially the electronic media. And this morning I sat down and did some research. And if you'll allow me to give you an insight into that research in terms of how the Indian media has brought the words of decapitation, beheading, and mutilation into this debate. The first statement was issued on January 8th by the Northern Command spokesman, and he said that 2 Indian soldiers had been killed. But he did not mention the words beheading, mutilation, or castration. So how did these words creep into the Indian media? Well, I looked at the Hindustan Times, I looked at the IANS, I looked at NDTV, and I looked at the Press Trust of India. And all of them quoted either civilian officials or military officials without naming them as saying that there had been a beheading. None of them in their reports of January 9th actually talked about castration or mutilation or anything like that. So that's the first thing. Then I went to the British press and I noticed an article in the London Telegraph by by Dean Nielsen, who says he talked to General Siranam, the army's formal spokesman. I forget his name. I think
Narasimhan, Major General Narasimhan.
Yes, Narasimhan. That's right, Major General Narasimhan. And he says that one soldier was mutilated, but he could not confirm the beheading. So there you are. Then on January 9th, I looked at the Reuters story.
Let me stop you there. I think you made your point because it's a very good and well-made point that, in fact, with different versions coming out, different elements were added on, and we moved from purely killed to mutilated to beheading. In other words, you're suggesting that the story was being embroidered and enlarged. I accept that point. Let me bring in Praveen Swami. I want to broaden the discussion, almost in the light of the point that you've heard just now from Najam Sethi. Would you accept that your story in the Hindu clearly shows that the Indian media, and perhaps last night's TV discussions in particular, were both one-sided and sometimes way over the top?
Yeah, absolutely. But let me add a small footnote of nuance, if you like, to that first. In fairness to the journalists who report these things, finding out the truth about what happens in the face of an often opaque and incompetent bureaucracy isn't easy. And particularly in an age where there's intense competitive pressure, people make mistakes. And I'm not defending those mistakes. I'm not defending hyping. I would hesitate to scapegoat journalists for this.
But what you are saying is that much of the discussion in the media, and I will freely say on television, was based upon facts that weren't verified, were based upon assumptions that weren't corroborated, and therefore, at times, it was close to poppycock.
It was close to poppycock, and sadly, that's been a feature of things happening in the Indian press for some time now.
Colonel Shukla, as a former army officer and as strategic affairs editor of the Business Standard, would you accept that something else that the media completely forgot or deliberately chose to overlook is that ceasefire violations tend to be retaliatory and tit for tat, and that was, as you pointed out a moment ago, very much the case this time round. And yet the discussions yesterday on TV ignored Pakistan's claim that Indian firing had resulted in a Pakistani soldier being killed on Sunday.
Absolutely, and it also, my great problem with the tone of the reporting is that the Indian army seems to have been portrayed as some kind of victim in this thing, which has been subjected to assault by a bigger, stronger, more powerful army. I think that when you see this from within the Indian army, and when I talk to my sources within the Indian army, it's seen completely different. It's seen really as a lapse. The patrol was not sufficiently ready to receive an attack like this and react to it. 2 soldiers' bodies have been essentially abandoned, and the beheading does not take place, mutilation does not take place in an instant. When you knew that this kind of climate was prevailing on the line of control, the patrol should have been a lot more alert. Now I know that there is an inquiry going on. The army is not one to spare mistakes within itself, especially tactical mistakes.
Okay.
So the army is essentially reacting to this story completely differently from the way that the news media, and especially the generals who are self-appointed spokespeople of the army, these retired generals, they are portraying the army as this victim, whereas the army is examining what flaws and what lapses took place. And one of them is that this patrol did not react in the manner that it should have.
I'll come back and pick up on that point you make about the patrol not reacting in the manner in which it should have. But let me pursue, Vinod Mehta, with you, in a sense, the question that frames our discussion tonight. I began by asking, was the media coverage jingoistic more than it was journalistic? After all that you've heard in the discussion so far, what's your answer to that question? Jingoism or journalism?
Well, Karan, first I must make the point that what is being suggested on your program is that the beheading either did not happen or was a piece of fiction created by the Indian army.
No, Vinod, forgive me, neither. I'm stopping you because you're wrong on both counts. What is being suggested on this program, and in fact stated as much by the Hindu article, is that A, the beheading did happen. In fact, it has happened on earlier occasions as well, as the Hindu says. But the more important point is that Indian soldiers in the past, according to accounts given to the Hindu by military sources, please note that, military sources, have also beheaded Pakistani soldiers. In other words, beheading has been done by both sides. They are equivalent in terms of the lack of moral compassion and compass.
I would say that when this beheading was done by Indian soldiers, I don't remember any Pakistani media mentioning this fact or the Indian media mentioning this fact. I'm not refuting the fact that Parveen Swami probably was told this. But whether it was a tit for tat, now we are going into a different, we are saying it's a tit for tat beheading. It's not a tit-for-tat retaliation on the border.
No, we're not saying, no, again, forgive me, again you're wrong. We're not saying it's a tit-for-tat beheading. We're saying that the 2 killings were tit-for-tat. On Sunday, Pakistan alleges India killed a Pakistani soldier.
What about the beheading?
3 days. The beheading,
what about the beheading?
On the beheading, the point the Hindus making is that Indian soldiers last year in Kanna, according to a military source, are alleged to have beheaded a Pakistani soldier.
Well, this is the first time I've heard about it, Karan. I'm sure this is the first time you've heard about it.
Let me bring in Najam Sethi. Najam Sethi, are you in Pakistan aware of incidents where it's been alleged that Indian soldiers have beheaded Pakistani soldiers, as the Hindu report suggests?
Yes, I have read about it, and I'm quite surprised that Vinod has not read an Indian war reporter's diary, which was published in 2001 in the magazine Himal. And that reporter mentioned a trip to Kargil in '99, where that reporter was taken to a place where that reporter saw a Pakistani soldier's beheaded body. and the Indian commander of that sector taking some pride in doing so.
All right.
That reporter's diary says that that reporter did not mention this until 2 years later because the country was engulfed in a state of nationalism.
Thank you
And
very
that
much.
reporter is today a top anchor in this country.
And that report, would you name him quickly?
That's Barkha Dutt.
Thank you very much indeed, Najam Sethi. Let's take a break at that point. I want to come back and pick up on another aspect of something that the Hindu reports that Colonel Shukla talked about a moment ago, which the press is either unaware of or has ignored, but which undoubtedly worries the Indian Army deeply. Join us in a moment's time, because this is still a critical part of this discussion. Welcome back to The Last Word. We're discussing the Indian media's coverage of the killing and mutilation of 2 Indian soldiers. Jingoism or journalism is the question. Ajay Shukla, let's come to an aspect of the ceasefire violation that no doubt worries the army enormously. You talked about it briefly a moment ago, but which has been almost entirely overlooked, except for a brief reference, I should add, on an inside page of the Hindu today. I'm talking of the fact that Pakistanis were able to intrude 600 meters into Indian territory, kill and mutilate 2 bodies, and return without suffering damage. The Hindu says that the headquarters of 25th Division in Rajouri have investigated or started an investigation into this. How seriously would the army worry about this?
Well, as you can see from the statements which were quoted by Najam Sethi a little earlier, the Indian Army is not squealing about it. The Indian Army has categorized this in very simple factual terms as an event that has happened. Internally, it is investigating why it happened, what were the lapses at local tactical level, at the operational level, and at the level of overall readiness that is happening. And you can bet your last boots that blame will be apportioned and the people who are responsible will be punished in some way.
Can I interrupt?
But none of this is...
Can I interrupt? As a former army colonel, how concerned are you by the fact that the rest of the members of the patrol, and after all, those 2 soldiers who got killed were not on their own, seem to have done nothing to stop the Pakistani attackers from either mutilating the bodies or getting away after the mutilation? How concerned are you as a former officer about that?
I am deeply concerned. During my career, during the Kargil war, in fact, I was the operations officer of exactly this sector. Incidents like this happened during that period as well, almost identical incidents. At every stage when you have a flashpoint, you pass instructions down the line to maintain high alert. You are expecting a retaliation, and everybody down the line, down to the last Jawan, knows that a retaliation is coming. To find that a patrol is still taken by surprise, and when it's taken by a surprise and it comes under attack, to allow 2 bodies to be... This is a lapse, Karan, there's no question. And the army knows it's a lapse. The army is probably investigating it, and you're not going to hear anything about it, but surely this is a lapse.
Let's come back from the army to journalism by people like you, me, and our colleagues. After the article that you've written and authored, what do you think are the lessons that Indian media needs to bear in mind? And let's be honest and say TV anchors in particular.
I think over the last few years, there's been a growing tendency for a polemical school of journalism where we see ourselves as advocates for or against a cause rather than as people who tell a story or try to tell the truth as best we can. And this is not something that happens only on India, Pakistan, but a spectrum of other things.
So you're saying stop being polemical?
Stop being polemical, stop thinking of news as a form of entertainment theatre. Try and tell the truth.
To what extent would you agree or disagree with that, Vinod Mehta? Quickly, please.
Well, I think, Karan, that we are assuming that the Indian news media only consists of electronic 24/7 television. The Indian news media also consists of the print media. And I thought the print media's coverage this morning was very balanced and very fair. And I just want to say one thing to Najam, that I'm surprised that he has to quote a Nepalese paper. I'm more interested to know whether Pakistani papers reported the beheading or not.
Right, let's leave that aside. But the interesting point you make about Indian journalism is that its image and reputation is salvaged by the print. Television on its own could have done better. Very quickly, Najam Sethi, Pakistani journalists have always believed that they are more independent and critical of the government on foreign policy issues, including India-Pakistan, that Indian journalists, in converse, tend to toe a government or nationalist line. Has this experience reinforced that belief in Pakistan? But a quick answer, please.
Yes, this experience is constantly being reinforced. I think there is a broad democratic consensus in India, and therefore the Indian media tends to follow foreign policy guidelines because there is a consensus. I think in Pakistan there is no consensus. We are constantly challenging our state's position on national security, and therefore there is more disagreement there. So I'm not surprised in the least.
Okay.
But when it comes to jingoism, I think both sides are vulnerable, and especially the vernacular media in our country, and I think both English and the vernacular media in your country tend to be pretty jingoistic. And I just want to respond to Vinod. You know, I was quoting a top Indian anchor. It hardly matters where that article first appeared.
All right. I'll leave you with the last word. My thanks to
anywhere in the Pakistani media.
Vinod, let's leave it there now. We've run right out of time. My apologies. My thanks to Vinod Mehta, Najam Sethi, Praveen Swami, and Ajay Shukla. This has been a sobering episode. It's got lessons for all of us that we need to observe carefully and think about deeply. Goodbye.